cyclic awakening. Tales from World Development.
The Cleansing Light by Colin Cubban. The Ambaic Coralam made its final maneuvers towards the station. In comparison to the majestic cogtooth spirals that made up the lonely space station superstructure, the forge bark wallowed silently like an ungainly void whale. Every tooth-like projection, some as large as the Coralam itself, and serving as docking piers, was lined with smaller protrusions, and these in turn were lined with more, on and on in a dizzying fractal design. Viewed from an axis, the station was snowflake-like, with its 6 protruding primary piers. Error, mused Logicus Dunal Rovarin as she worked. The Falacor terminus is like a component of the Omnissire's celestial engine. Nothing like the station existed anywhere else in Metalica's stellar system, for its heritage spoke undeniably of Mars. Upon first encountering it, Dunal had opinioned it was a triumphal example of 32nd millennium re-expansion. Titrain Jordeth, Dunal's overseer and fellow tech priest, tartly responded that it was a yoke of Martian hegemony, best left out here in the Forge World system's furthest reaches. The Coralam settled half a mile from the nearest docking pier spur on the dark side of the terminus. Its dark edges barely lit by the Coralam's running lights, the station's outline was discernible against the backdrop of stars. Above one outcrop of its architecture, Metalica's star could be glimpsed. At half a light year away, to biological eyes it was indistinguishable from the vastly more distant stars around it. Dunal's gunmetal optics span and clicked in the metal of her face as part of her mind ran orbital auguries on the star. She stood at the ship's dark and cramped bridge station, the majority of her focus coordinating the Coralam's extraordinary umbilical. Dozens of feet in diameter, the mechanical appendage slowly stretched its way across the gap between the forge bark and the station. Enormous heat sinks and strange devices like inverted void shield generators studied its surface, along with slab-sided power housings emitting turquoise light from a lattice of grills. Bulkheads ran through it like cartilage, and at each intersection was a vast portal of hyperdense alloys, sealing off section after section of the umbilical. They resembled the doors to vast treasure vaults, or the hatches of oubliettes holding dangerous guests. Jordeth's vine-like mechadendrites were integrated, like Dunal's, into the umbilical's controls. Through them, Jordeth sensed the other tech priest's distraction and sent an irritable burst of calibrations into Dunal's hemisphere of operation. They forced her to swiftly and unnecessarily recalculate several perimeters. "Attend fully, Logicus," the Trichine snapped. "This is not an orbital transfer shaft. We must work in absolute synchrony to ensure the entreaties to each of the umbilical's machine spirits are received with grace. Apologies. Full cognition is restored. Is the Magos certain this level of protection is necessary? The weapon is fully secure, surely. Do not question the Magos's certainty, Logicus." Somehow, Jordeth managed to load Dunal's signifier with disdain through subtle use of Metalica's high elecon cant and careful positioning of his subordinate mechadendrites. The weapon is secure. The Magos's research, however, revealed that additional caution must be taken. The exact efficiency of the weapon is unknown. It is part of our sacred duty to present the Magos with a full assessment of its capabilities, as well as recovering the artifact itself. This station is of the Red Planet. We cannot assume the compliance of its machine spirit. This is an inordinate honor. The successful operation of the reclamation fleet is dependent on our holy endeavors. The umbilical crossed the final stretch of silent space, its surface dusted with icy fragments. Even on the bridge of the Coloram, Dunal detected the heavy mechanical reverberations as its claw-like clamps locked into position on the station's airlock. A picked thief showed her the ranks of waiting servitors at its entrance sway with the movement. It was an inestimable tribute of Metalica to grant Reclamation Fleet M4 Hugh Omega one of its most precious Arcania Mechanicum, a gesture of unity between those who would vie for power during the long voyage in the dark. Dunal could not fully explain to herself why the Magos had dispatched Jordeth and herself here and none other. There were adepts in far higher favour with the Magos than even Jordeth believed himself to be. With deft impulses, Dunal ordered the dozens of servitors, logojacks, and mechanothralls through the umbilical, and past each slowly hinging or rising portal. Led by a humming servo-skull that had once been a high-ranking Lex Mechanic. Dunal knew Jordeth did not know what the Magos had learned, that he would have artlessly boasted of such confidence. All they had been given was this location, millions of miles from Metalica, and a hexaclyphus signal key that the Magos claimed would be needed to secure the weapon. The only information the two tech priests had been able to glean had come from mnemo echoes that resounded through Metalica's invisible data fields. The weapon had been wielded in millennia past by the Forge Lords of Metalica, aiding them in the quest for knowledge by wiping out mutants, Xenos, and engines corrupted by the Immaterium. It was said to have saved and purified the forge worlds of Thoromest, Fardal Majoris, and Stelly Lex, yet none knew where these planets had lain or if their forges still survived. After an unknown crisis, the weapon had been hidden, supposedly at Mars' tyrannical insistence. Until the Magos' discovery, not even the Fabricator General of Metalica had known that it was here, at the very edge of the Forge World system. Only the weapon's name remained certain: Radiant Wrath. After a elongated exchange between the Coloram's cognitator engine and the controls of the docking pier, Dunal and Jordeth's servitors gained entry. Cognitor engine and the controls of the docking pier, Dunal and Jordeth's servitors gained entry. The tech priests watched avidly through the manifold senses of their proxies. The Magos had insisted that neither of them were to board the terminus in person, thus they were forced to experience its holy aura vicariously through the limited senses of their cyborg thralls. Ancient lumen strips flickered, olfac scans registered ozone and unusual hydrocarbon scents. Shimmering curtains of data flapped like seaweed in currents of pulsing energy, passed through by the unheeding servitors as though they were mist, or hung like tapestries over laser-etched representations of the opus machina. Despite binaric entreaties, there was no direct response from the station's controlling logic engine, merely automated alerts from outlying systems, nor did there appear to be any physical crew. The servitors lumbered, hovered, and wove their way through an interminable corridor through the station's deserted interior. Sprays of sanctified incense and blurts of binaric prayer haunted their step as they moved in procession. Their relative positions echoed Metalica's varied radium frequencies. The servitors passed sealed chambers bearing warnings in dialecto linguina technis that had not been broadcast in millennia, and black passages down which the thin atmosphere trickled as if pulled by some void beyond. With a final turn of the corridor, Dunal suddenly commanded the servitors to halt as her flesh voice gasped, and even Jordeth loosed an involuntary binaric curse. The passage terminated suddenly. The space beyond was a vast chasm. There were lights here, but they failed to fill the enormous space and glittered like weak stars. A smudge of grey was visible in the distance where the servitor's cranial lumen blazed dead ahead. There was still no response to the colorum's repeated hails, yet the servitor's presence had disturbed something. Some of the distant stars in that immense space were moving. With a suddenness that made the tech priests jump, light flared like a dozen miniature suns. The void was lit. It was spherical, and at its centre, on anti-gravitic impulses, hung a lead-coloured cube some 30 metres across. The inside of the sphere was encrusted with thousands of heavy-bore weapons on gimbaled turrets, and the stars the tech priests had glimpsed were their targeting reticules. 20 or so of the nearest had swung to face the servitors. Hoppers churned, and ammo feeds spun, while plasma cells thrummed at high power. All the others remained fixed on the leaden cube. "Attend, I am detecting intrusion," Jordeth blurted, his 4 mechanical manipulators and 3 mechadendrites flashing between ship controls. "Omnisire, the data stacks. Something has breached our firewalls. It is ravenous. I have no control." "What is it? Are we under attack?" Dunal asked, seeing the same aggressive invasion displayed in flickering columns of data. Jordeth suddenly looked up at the oculus arrays showing the weapon system's targeting, yet not firing upon, the servitors, and his silvered irises narrowed in understanding. "It is the station, the terminus. We have awoken its central machine spirit. By the auric ratio, I have never witnessed such power, such finesse. It will kill us." Dunal hastily disconnected each of her tentacular mechadendrites from the Coloram's systems. "It could have done that already, Logicus. It is interrogating our logic core. It will find the Magus's hexaclavus file. Do not make any transmission. The Magus's signal key will suffice," said Jordeth, though his cant was tinged with wavering variables. After several macroseconds, a series of runic indicators flashed. The dull grey cube in the sphere's centre moved slowly towards the tunnel's entrance, where the remaining servitors were still pinned under the glare of the nearest turrets. Every other visible weapon system followed the cube's movement with mechanical precision. As it neared, the tech priests saw its almost featureless flanks contained a single viewing portal, and the passive arrays hidden within the former Lex Mechanic's skull detected the unmistakable chromatic waveforms of stasis technology. The cube docked with the passage with a clank of metal. "Is it safe? Can we?" Dunal's voice trailed off. Jordeth's manipulators danced over runic controls, and his grill emitted grating benedictions. The servitors responded and approached the unreflective cube, the servo skull hovering to point its multiple optics and sensor vanes through the viewing portal. The tech priests watched, rapt, as the detectors slowly swept the interior. Stasis vaults lined the cube's walls, filled not with the esoteric techno-arcana they were expecting, but with Factorum-produced items of quotidian quality. Disconnected bionic limbs and loops of dusty data tethers. There was a weapons rack in one stasis vault, but the radium carbine inside was scuffed and smoke-stained. Donal could not understand. This carbine was not a purifying weapon that would ensure the reclamation fleet's success. The Magos had been deceived. The servo skull's optics peered into the final corner, where a large stasis sarcophagus sat. Winking indicators showed its systems had entered a revive mode. Most of the armor glass was frosted and crazed with some distorting patina, but the dull robes of Metalica were visible inside, the gunmetal bionics of known forge temples and armor plates dulled with grime. The stasis vault's countdown completed, and the distinctive helmet of a Skitaris vanguard lifted slowly to face the portal. The Coloram sat above Scorifex's equatorial belt, where the Forge World's major temples still burned in psychic conflagration. The remainder of the Magos' reclamation fleet remained on the other side of the system, leaving the Forge Bark to approach alone. The Coloram was not a warship, yet none of the fleet sought to closely guard its exposed flanks. The Magos' indentured astropaths detected the final frantic cries of their kin upon Scorifex. The fleet's psychic messengers shrieked tearfully of predatory sentiences drawn from the warp, nightmares of blood and oil brought forth by witch breeds in the Forge World's slave population. The Skitaris from the Falacor terminus occupied a specially constructed dropship in one of the Coloram's rear launch bays, as far from the bridge as possible. Autonomic signifiers identified the warrior as Skitaris Luminor 000011, though few refer to it as anything other than Radiant Wrath. It seemed incapable of transmitting intelligibly, and every attempt to analyze its emitters resulted in the loss of yet another servitor. The Coloram had lost more than 50 during the transit from Metalica, in addition to all those who had set foot upon the station. The Magos had not been deceived after all, thought Donal, as she looked at the blackened puckering of her flesh around the implants that flaked with crumbling oxides. The purifying weapon was simply one that walked and thought. The emissions from the silent soldier were unprecedented. They bled into everything, a gale of zeta particles, blowing in a torrent from every part of its body. Servitors in the same section of the hold swiftly lost their biological components, their waxy skin blackening and sloughing away in a matter of moments. Metallic compounds scorched, cracking and crumbling. How the warrior's own components survived such a barrage was not something that could be determined, not on the Forge Bark. Jordath and Donal had desperately marshalled their remaining servitors in work rotas through the tempestuous journey in the warp, barely keeping the ship running as the Skitaris radiation leached into the ship's superstructure. Twice they received emergency supplies from the rest of the fleet via disposable shuttle. No other ship could get close. Though Jordath and Donal kept themselves as far away as they could, they had been forced to replace many of their flesh and bionic components repeatedly. The Magos promised that ultra-deionization protocols would be enacted once Radiant Wrath was away from the ship, assuring the two tech priests that replacement augmetics were more than sufficient for now. Donal wasn't sure. The Logicus watched the dropship containing a Radiant Wrath hit Scorifex's atmosphere through the single bionic eye Jordath had allowed her from the last shipment. The Trickine having sequestered the choicest replacements. Her thoughts were disorganized. Delicate neural threading had provided replacement meat for her brain where it had withered, but it was as if her calculations had somehow become sluggish as well. "It will be worth it," she told the tech priest beside her. "Scorifex will be tainted for hundreds of millennia, but it will be pure and purged, a testament to the glory of Metalica and the machine god." Jordath had not been able to respond for days. The physical manifestations of the Skitaris' furious aura were not where its effects ended. Streams of tumorous logo scripts had multiplied in Jordeth's noosphere, parameters expanding and twisting in the trichined neural architecture, facts distorting, knowledge, the gilded jewel held in awe by every tech priest, bloated with a kind of replicating and mutating viral curse, one that Dunal could see swelling in her own cogitations. Logicus Dunal had hidden her fear in regular updates to the Magos. She suppressed an unpleasantly emotional burst of fear. She was part of something wondrous and divine. Every great endeavor had its martyrs.